You're listening to Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Are you scared? Are you holding your pillow?
Are you afraid of the dark?
Well, don't worry, kids. Jimmy will save you. The truth will set you free. Live from the JP Motorsports Studio in Burbank, California, broadcasting around the globe. I'm Steve Harder. And now, for your host, the captain of conspiracy, the prince of paranormal. This ain't your daddy's radio show. This is Jimmy Church. Fade to Black.
Hi. All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Thursday, December 26th, 2013, one day after Christmas. I hope everybody out there had a great time with your family yesterday and it was safe. We are live from the JP Motorsports Studios right here in Burbank, California. I know it is cold and chilly around the country, but it was about 80 degrees here today in Burbank. I wore sandals all day. For KJCR and the Dark Matter Radio Network, I am your host, Jimmy Church. You know how I start off every show. I started off with a salute to the proud men and women in uniform all around the world fighting the good fight for us. Without them, there is no me, there is no you, there is no us. All right, let's get this show. We have a great show lined up tonight. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Everything is Fade to Black. Our Twitter account was hacked last week, so for all of you conspiracy people out there, go and sign up and follow us on Twitter. The link is right there on the website. By the end of the show, we should have about another 500 Twitter followers. All right. Tonight, we have open lines. So get it going right now. The Skype number is Fade to Black 14. Get in line. We will be taking your calls later on tonight. You can email us throughout the show. I'll get to you as many as I can. Email to Jimmy at jimmychurchradio.com. Very simple. Or you can go over to the website. Just go to the contact page where we use exclusively non-NSA specially encrypted servers for your safety. All right. The bumper music tonight, all of the bumper music on the show tonight is from a guitarist named Doug Aldrich. Doug is the guitar player, a guitar player in the band Whitesnake and a friend of mine. And so we're using his music tonight on today's show. So a big thank you to Doug. In the second segment tonight, we will have live from New Mexico, Noria Hayakawa. He's another OG original Area 51 researcher, and he'll be in the second hour, and if we have some time, we'll try to take your calls then. We have posted up on the site. I want everybody to go check out on jimmychurchradio.com. We've got a virtual viewer. It is really cool, of the Giza pyramids. Go check that out. It is a real-time 3D viewer. You can choose your view, your helicopter view. You're going to spend a lot of time on it. I wasted a half hour of my life today on that viewer. It is absolutely amazing. But click on the little speaker button to turn off the music so you can listen to me tonight on the show. Okay? All right. Let's get this show going. We've got a busy, packed show, and it is going to be great. I have always promised that the best, the brightest will be on this show, and tonight is no exception. Nuclear physicist lecturer Stanton T. Friedman received his BSc and MSc degrees in physics from the University of Chicago in 1955 and 1956. He was employed for 14 years as a nuclear physicist by such companies as GE, GM, Westinghouse, TRW Systems, Aerojet General Nucleonics, and McDonnell Douglas, working in such highly advanced, classified, eventually canceled programs as nuclear aircraft, fission and fusion rockets, and various compact nuclear power plants. He became interested in UFOs in 1958, and since 1967 has lectured about them at more than 600, this is a mouthful, 600 colleges, 100 professional groups in 50 states, 10 Canadian provinces, and 18 other countries. He has published more than 90 UFO papers and has appeared on hundreds of radio and TV programs. He is the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. He co-authored The Crash at Corona, the definitive study of the Roswell incident, and my personal favorite, Top Secret Magic. He has provided written testimony to congressional hearings and has appeared twice at the United Nations. And I got to tell you, Stanton, that is an impressive bio. How are you tonight?
Oh, I'm very good here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, where it was 10 below this morning and we had about 8 inches of snow today to go with the 3 feet we already had this fall-winter season.
So no sandals.
No sandals. No sandals at all. Although I was in Brazil less than a month ago, and it was 85 down there.
Well, you can get your warm on, I guess, but then you've got to eventually go back to the snow. But right now, I'm not wearing socks. So there you go.
Look at you.
All right. Well, this isn't an interview. This is a conversation.
Okay.
And I'm very excited about having you on. It is an honor, but and you hear that all the time, but I really appreciate it. But we're going to do this in a few different sections, but it's just a conversation. And the way that I feel that my listeners, our listeners on the Dark Matter Radio Network, if I find it interesting, they will too. So it's just a conversation. Okay.
Good.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Let's talk about MJ-12 first. The MJ-12 documents, now for most people listening to this show and the Art Bell, fan base out there, know about the MJ-12 documents. But for the ones that don't, for the new listeners, what are they and when did they first appear? How and when did they first appear?
Well, in December 1984, my colleague, Jamie Chandray and William Moore and I had worked together on Roswell-related stuff. And a roll of film arrived at Jamie's house in the Hollywood area, and it was unprocessed, and it didn't have a return address, and Bill has processed a lot of film. Roll of 35, people may not remember, there used to be 35-millimeter film out there, And he processed it, and it turns out there were 2 sets of 8 negatives each of a briefing for President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower, and it was labeled Top Secret Magic, M-A-J-I-C, and dated in November 1952. Now, the context here is that Ike had just won the election for president less than about a month earlier, and this was a briefing for the president-elect. He didn't actually become president until 1953. And in this briefing, and it's eyes only for the president alone, in other words, it's a briefing which states that the Roswell incident happened. I'll summarize this. I'm not going to read from it. And that this group, Operation Majestic 12, was set up by President Truman in September of 1947 to deal with what happened at Roswell and to serve as a central clearinghouse, if you will, for the important UFO stuff. 12 members on the group were listed. And they all made sense except one. In other words, if you're going to have a top secret group, they all have to have high-level security clearances. You got to have competent people. And boy, this was an all-star cast.
Well, with
3 former directors of Central Intelligence, for example.
Exactly, but it was it was called Majestic, I believe, right? The first,
yes.
It said, had anybody, yourself or Jamie Chandray at the time, was this the first time anybody had ever heard the words Majestic or Magic 12?
In any kind of sensible context, yes. This wasn't preaching to the converted. In other words, we didn't already have our mitts on MJ-12 or Majestic 12, Magic 12. No. And the problem was that, I'm a nuclear physicist. I like to have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. And here, this looked too good to be true, and there was one really strong point that worried me in the list of people. I mean, the Secretary of Defense was on there, and Dr. Vannevar Bush, and it was a really top-notch group of people, except that how in the world could Dr. Donald Howard Menzel of Harvard University be a member of such a group that knew all about flying saucers, alien bodies. It talks about Roswell, recovery of bodies and stuff. When Menzel wrote 3 anti-UFO books.
He was the biggest skeptic of the time.
So supposedly,
right.
And also, you don't need a high-level security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard. You know? Unless he was there for a reason. Well, that was the kicker. What I'm saying is we didn't dare to go public.
Right.
Until we had a lot more information, because all we needed was to go public, and then somebody say, "Gotcha! I made that up myself, and you guys fell for it."
When you guys,
UFO guys,
I don't want to jump. I don't want to jump ahead, but when you guys did eventually go public with this, was there any official government response? Anything immediate?
No. There was later when. The guy who wrote the big report about Roswell, Colonel Weaver, made a passing comment to Nick Redfern from England, now living in Texas, that everybody says the MJ-12 documents are fraudulent. And it was a quick comment. It wasn't an explanation or anything. It was just a statement. And the kicker is this, that I've heard, I think, every criticism that's been made of the reports, the documents. Now, I should stress, there's well over 100 MJ-12 documents. I say 3 of them are definitely genuine and 1 probably is. The rest are phonies. And people say, what do you mean? If they're phony, why aren't these phony? Because you look at the specifics. And in my books, I've shown that some of them are phony with wrong information, false information, lifting something that I found in a book as if it was an original document when in fact it wasn't, stuff like that.
Typefaces and grammar possibly too?
Well, yeah, all that kind of stuff. And there were some crucial things that were, that I could show made sense, although I didn't know it beforehand. There are dates in this thing of when somebody met with somebody else, and I could check. I've been to 20 archives over the years, presidential archives and the Library of Congress and a whole bunch of places. If somebody paid me full time, that's how I'd spend my life, because I love digging into things like that.
No kidding.
I should stress, I had a security clearance for 14 years. And so I know a lot about security. I wrote classified documents myself. I mention this not to brag, but only because I hear some really stupid things from people who, I've had people tell me, well, Stan, surely those members of MJ-12 would have told their wives what they were doing. And of course, that's not true. I never told my wife anything classified.
Mm-hmm.
People working under security don't. It's risky. It's dangerous. And especially if the enemies think they can get stuff from your family and not from you, bad deal. I've had people tell me, well, everything is declassified after 25 years, Stan. Didn't you know that? No, I didn't. Some people think if you've got a top secret clearance, you have access to all top secret documents. That's totally untrue. You need to have a need to know. So just having a clearance, it won't get you access. You have to be approved for access. But there are specifics in the documents. The ones I'm proudest of, besides what I found out about Dr. Menzel, and that came as a shock to me. I had one run-in with him while he was alive. All these guys were dead. The last one died just a few months before we got this roll of film. How convenient one.
Coincidence. Yeah, right.
And besides Dr. Menzel, there were other things in the documents that made you be cautious. You check the dates, and they're okay. There is a place where it says the briefing officer was Admiral Roscoe H. Hillencoder. Now, he had been a director of Central Intelligence, but he was not an admiral. He was only a rear admiral, and some people have said, aha, that proves it's phony. Well, at the Eisenhower Library, I was able to find that there were minutes taken of meetings at the White House by General Goodpaster, who was Ike's staff secretary. He'd write minutes after each meeting of who said what and what work had to be done and so forth. And these are called MEMCONs, Memorandum of Conversations. And he lists the attendees at these meetings. And he lists them all by generic rank, the military ones. General Jones, Admiral Smith, that sort of thing.
He doesn't say
right.
He doesn't say 4-star Jones, Rear Admiral.
No,
a generic. Right.
And even himself, the proof of the pudding was he was listed as one of the attendees, General Goodpaster. He signed the memo, Brigadier General Goodpaster. And yet I've had some critics say, well, obviously the document's fraudulent because of that rear. He wasn't an admiral; he was a rear admiral. I talked to two different archivists at the Eisenhower Library, asked them whether this use of generic ranks bothered them, and they both said independently, "Of course not. That was standard practice."
Right.
And if you read a book that Ike wrote, you'll find his use of generic ranks.
Well,
so
let me jump in.
One thing.
Let me jump in really quick. You said there was 4 of the set that you feel that are genuine. 3, probably 4. Were those on the original roll of film?
No, there were. The original roll of film had the Eisenhower briefing document, and it had the Truman-Forrestal memo. That was the memo from Truman to Forrestal in 1947. Establishing Operation Majestic 12, accountable only to the President of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That was the enabling start of everything. The third one was found. We had been getting some strange postcards, actually.
Well, I know where you're going, and I'm going to ask you about that in 1 second. But okay. I just want to be clear. So everything was on film. How many of the documents of Majestic are actual paper?
Well, the one that was found, the third one, is a memo from Cutler, Robert Cutler, who was Ike's national security advisor, slightly different title back then, to General Nathan Twining. And in it, in the heading, it mentions Majestic 12. A meeting is going to be held at a certain time. It was supposed to be held at another time. It just notified the right people that there's been a change. And people jumped on that one, the Cutler Twining. That's available if you go to the National Archives, which has been moved now to College Park, Maryland. They'll pull out a copy of the original Majestic, that memo, the Cutler Twining memo.
Well, how you found this memo, how Shandera found this memo, I think is one of the more intriguing stories out of it. You started to touch upon that when you mentioned the postcards.
It was kind of weird. They were getting strange postcards from hither, thither, and yon. Anybody can send mail, no big deal. But there was enough information here to suggest that somebody should be going to Washington and checking at one of the archives there. And so Bill and Jamie, who were hoping to make a movie out of this whole thing and a book and all kinds of deal. I mean, I'm on the East Coast, they're on the West Coast, and they went and they looked. We were notified that certain papers were being reviewed, that had been reviewed by the government at the National Archives. So they went to that file, and one of the postcards mentioned a certain post office box, and it turns out this was a file box that they found those papers in.
At the National Archives.
National Archive, yes, National Archives. And the kicker was that when you looked at this document, it's original paper, and it even has a slant red pencil mark through the security marking, and I didn't find out until later what that meant. I asked an archivist, not there, but at the Eisenhower Library, what does that mean? That slant red pencil mark through the security mark. He said, well, that's standard practice here. When you're going to declassify a document, you do that so people will know that it's been declassified. You have to stamp it with the appropriate security markings, but still. Now, I didn't know that, and like I said, I spent a lot of time at archives, and nobody else I knew it, but it was an indicator of legitimacy.
Where's the Cutler Twining memo right now? Is it back at the archives?
Yes. Oh, yes. You can't take original documents out. You can get copies made.
Okay, so that's what happened.
You can find them in my books and stuff like that. And it's brief. And the kicker about the Cutler-Twining memo is that Mr. Philip Klass, who was the biggest noisy negativist, noisy naysayer, anti-UFO guy you ever saw, he was a senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology in Washington. So he was the go-to debunker because he was convenient right there in Washington, you know?
Right.
Not a scientist, you understand.
Oh, no.
A debunker. And the FBI doesn't like him. You can go on the internet and see his FBI file, and they were very upset about him, but they couldn't prosecute him because to do so for leaking classified information, they would have to reveal the information. They didn't want to do that, but they had some very strong words to say about him. Anyway, I got challenged about this one. Perhaps you didn't notice, Phil said to me in a letter, that it was done in the large pica type, but the standard at the National Security Council is elite type, and he had 9 documents to prove that. He challenged me. I will give you $100 each for every genuine document meeting a whole bunch of criteria.
Do you still have the check?
Done in the same size and style type
right.
as the Cutler-Twining memo. Well, Phil has never been, and I've checked since, never in his life was at the Eisenhower Library. I've spent weeks there. And I was going there anyway. Shortly after that, he gave me 60 days, but 2 weeks later, I was at the Eisenhower Library. And looked for pica-type memos meeting all his criteria. And I quickly found them. Pica-type is bigger. It shows up. I hope people know what typewriters are.
Right,
There aren't many around anymore. But anyway, I found 14 documents. He set a limit up to a maximum of 10. So I figured I had insurance with 14, you know. So I dug out 14. I made copies. I sent him copies of them and an invoice for $1,000, 10 times 100. And he paid me. Now, he told everybody about challenging me and nobody about paying me. But here's the crazy part. And this is typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. I like the way that sounds.
That was nice.
As I pointed out to people, anybody who'd listen, the Eisenhower Library had 250,000 pages of National Security Council materials. To generalize from 9 done in a certain typewriter to a certain typeface to 250,000 is ridiculous. I mean, if you had 100 documents and 99 were all done in the, let's say, elite type, and you don't have the 100th, but you know it's there because it's referenced, then you might be legitimate in saying it's probably done in the same type. But from 9 to 250,000 does not compute. But that's typical of, like I say, the false arguments that are made. And let me mention my findings about Dr. Menzel. As I said, I had one run-in with him. I was speaking to a Harvard engineering alumni group, and I called him early in the day. We had never talked. And I gave him my name. Oh, I know all about you. I said, oh, you saw my congressional testimony next to yours? No, I've seen letters and memos. You can't be a scientist and believe in flying saucers, he said. So I laughed because it was such a funny remark. And he got angry and started ranting and raving. And I said, look, Dr. Menzel, I didn't call to argue with you. I called out of courtesy. I'm speaking on your campus. I don't know whether they've made it, invitations available to everybody or whether it's a closed group. I never know. On some campuses, you don't know who's sponsoring you and who's going to be let in.
Mm-hmm.
And so he backed off a little bit and said, oh, well, of course I won't go. So I told the story that night at the lecture that I gave. I couldn't resist. But so I was not a fan of Dr. Menzel. However, I found a letter in the papers of Dr. Vannevar Bush, one of the top scientists during the war, headed the, ran, I don't know, dozens and dozens of technical projects having to do with radar, the proximity fuse. He was present at the first test of the atomic bomb, et cetera, et cetera. A real wheel. And in his papers, I found a memo from a lawyer in Boston thanking him for his assistance in getting Dr. Menzel off on this charge of being disloyal. And I look at this and say, what the heck is that all about? Why would Menzel, they were going to take away his security clearance. Why would he have one? And, what's the kicker here? So I called the lawyer firm and found out that there's over 1,100 pages of stuff about the hearings. Nothing in the newspapers. Washington Post, New York Times, didn't see anything. So I called him. Harvard had over 1,100 pages. I called Harvard. How could I get access to his papers? It turns out I had to get permission from 3 different people, including his wife, to look at his unpublished autobiography. So I did that, written permission, mind you, and I got a grant from the Fund for UFO Research, and I went down to Harvard. And I spent 3 days, and I was totally shocked. I was blown away. I didn't know where to look because his UFO papers were supposedly at the American Philosophical Society Library in Washington, D.C. So, what's going on here? Where would I find UFO stuff? Well, I saw a file that said JFK, so I decided to look there, and that was the eye-opener, the real lucky break. It turns out that Menzel knew JFK because he was on the board of overseers at Harvard, and his area of interest was astronomy, and Menzel worked closely with him on that, and he really liked JFK, as Menzel's wife told me that, partly because Kennedy wrote his own report instead of asking Menzel to do it. A lot of the other people said, well, Don, why don't you write the report, And they're in correspondence between the two. Not only are they on a first-name basis, but this is in the campaign year of 1960, Kennedy running for president, and Menzel says, there's one area where I may be able to be of some assistance. I was at a longer continuous association with the National Security Agency and its Navy predecessor. NSA, no such agency, never says anything. Mr. Snowden's releasing angels.
Right.
Menzel's telling him, I've had a long continuous association. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. This is what he says to the president.
Right. I mean, that must have been a tremendous aha moment. I mean,
it was. And then I found a bunch of other things in Menzel's own comments. Those hearings, he said, were the worst experience of his life. I mean, one of the reasons you get a kick out of why he was considered disloyal. He gave a pair of stockings to a Russian astronomer to take to his wife, and nylons were big currency back in World War II.
I heard about that.
He led an eclipse expedition in the Soviet Union in 1936, obviously disloyal. And he said nice things at a Russian-American friendship dinner in 1942, when everybody said nice things, because thank goodness for the Russians holding off the Germans so we could get organized and eventually attack on Normandy and so forth. But I mean, this was a real hearing, and it was a terrible experience for him. But so this certainly wasn't disloyal. But he did classified work for the FBI, for the CIA, for all kinds of people.
Exactly, which would explain why, I mean, to my eyes, reading into this is exactly why he would be part of MJ-12. Makes sense.
He was a world-class cryptographer. He taught cryptography. He learned Japanese to help break the Japanese codes. And so there were symbols on some of the pieces from Roswell, for example. He's the perfect guy to look at those. But he did all this work, and nobody knew about it. There are 2 special issues of Sky and Telescope magazine. And one at the anniversary of his death was dedicated, when he died, was dedicated to Menzel. One at the 100th anniversary of his birth. Neither one of these say anything at all about his highly classified work after the war, which is kind of remarkable.
Which included just
Harvard who didn't know about it.
Exactly, and it included every single intelligence agency that we had running at the time in the country. He was involved with every single one.
He was top dog, and so I developed a healthy respect for him. And I had people, I haven't yet to find a critic who has actually visited the archives at Harvard to find anything on which to base a criticism of my conclusion that Don Menzel certainly belonged on this group. Also, incidentally, he wrote science fiction.
That's right.
that suits him for writing cover stories, if you will. And his first book, interestingly enough, was translated into Russian. I wonder why that happened.
Well, okay, we're short on time. I want to touch on a couple of other things really quick. In 1982, so you had these documents, you've been researching, you're spending all of this time at the archives. But back in 1982, Bill Moore approached you about creating those bogus Roswell documents. And then you had that whole Richard Doty Project Aquarius teletype thing. So when you combine that later on, did it question your own judgment on the documents? Did you look back and go, maybe, just maybe I'm being fooled?
Well, I was always wary of that. Look, I had an experience in the 5th grade. Our teacher was teaching us science and telling us that the sun stands still and the planets go around the sun. And I had just read in my 49-cent a volume encyclopedia at home that the whole solar system is moving around the galaxy at 12 miles a second. So I objected, and she gave me a very hard time. So I didn't sass a teacher, but I brought in the encyclopedia the next day, and she backed off. But it taught me a very important lesson: facts in hand before mouth in gear. And I was in debating in high school. We had a state championship team one year, and the same holds true. Have facts ready to go and never make up anything.
Well,
I have a gray basket.
But Jamie Shandera was collaborating, with Bill Moore since, 79, 1980.
Well, I got the two of them together, actually.
Well, do you think the two of them knew about Arthur Bray? Well, we didn't even get a chance to talk about the Canadian connection with this whole thing.
But I don't think they knew any more than I did. I looked at the Bray papers in Ottawa and the Wilbur Smith papers with our Bray stuff. No, we had a falling out about several things, but it wasn't. There was no suspicion. People have way overstated the notion that, we ought to fake some documents, and I can see the point. You put some bait out there and see who jumps for it. But
sure.
I didn't appreciate that, and I was at the 89 MUFON meeting where Bill went on and on and on and said some dumb things, and I was very upset about that, because I was supposed to get a copy of his paper before he gave it, and I didn't. And but Bill, I got to say for Bill, he was a hard-working guy. He'd go off and dig stuff out, find out about people. He had his flaws, and he got out of the business, and, that's a separate story. But I've been willing to look at everybody's objections to the MJ-12 documents. And, because if there's a fact that I can't repudiate or can't refute, if there's something about them that doesn't stand up, then I want to know it. I want to be the one to break the story, not them. And I have, in my books, you will notice that I have identified a number of documents as fraudulent and tell you why.
Exactly.
And I was good. I live a mile from the University of New Brunswick here in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And I called the archivist at the Marshall Archives, General George Marshall, and I said, can you think of any reason why this particular general should be connected with MJ-12? Because it said that in one of the documents. And he said, no, he doesn't belong there. Why don't you read his book? Oh, what book? He gave me the title, and I called the university library over here, which I use quite a lot. And they had the book. I went over and got it, took it out. And there were 3 documents that had been copied, basically, retyped to some extent, but with exact language. And where the signatures, the handwritten stuff, fit right on top of it. These were clearly what I call emulations, made to look as if they were something that they weren't. So it was very handy to find these documents and to have the university there, and that gave me a clue as to how they were being faked, and so I found some other materials. It was a hunt for clues.
Right.
And it was fascinating and exciting. And so I finally got my act together. I'm the Grandma Moses of the UFO book writers. I didn't write books until I was an old guy. Now my name's on five of them, and I've written forwards for several others. People like me to write forwards for them.
Well,
I don't get paid for that, incidentally.
So today, are you comfortable in the way that you've? I mean, you have been staunch. You have stood your ground. Do you feel that? Do you feel as positive today as you did 15, 20 years ago?
Yes, I do. About these few documents. Remember, I am not saying, and people always ask the wrong questions. Are those MJ-12 documents genuine? Well, you got to look at each one.
Right. I'm talking about the four. Yeah, the four that you've always stood by.
Yes, I am satisfied about them, and I would love for somebody else to get a roll of film over here. I'd like to see some more. But people forget, incidentally, that the guy who was at risk. I mean, the envelope didn't have a return address on it that brought the original roll of film. But the guy who sent the envelope is the guy who's at risk. It is against the law to release classified information to people who don't have a clearance and a need to know.
Exactly.
So he couldn't just, well, these guys are all dead. Why don't you just tell us what's going on? That's against the law.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I get condemned by some people. I tell them I am not for disclosing everything about flying saucers, because I think there's some legitimate national security matters there.
Of course there is.
Are the Russians and Chinese going to release their technical data that they've gleaned from any crashed saucers that they have recovered? I don't think so.
I can answer that. No.
Okay.
Well,
so you see my point, and people give me a hard time for that.
Exactly.
Aren't we all entitled to know everything? No.
All right, let's change gears. Let's change gears a little bit here. Let's get a little fun. John G. Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey, changed my life. Now, and I'm going to take the time here. I'm going to give you a 30-second story really quick. In 1983, I'm a kid. I'm like 21 years old or something. It's 30 years ago. I move into this house in Pasadena. It's an empty house. And I move in, and I'm walking through this empty house. All the walls painted white, fresh carpet. I have no furniture. There's nothing in this house. And in one of the bedrooms, I find 2 paperback books on a bookshelf up on the top of the closet. And one of them was The Interrupted Journey. Now, I didn't have, it was crazy because I didn't have a TV. I didn't have a radio. I might have had a blanket and a pillow that first night, that I moved in the house. And I started reading that book, and it freaked me out. And it changed my life. Wow. And so let's talk about, let's start from the beginning a little bit in case anybody isn't familiar. I know you've got a new book out about this, but Betty and Barney Hill had claimed to have been abducted by ETs in, it was New Hampshire, 1960, 1961? 61. Take us through the events of that evening, really quick, okay. the abridged version.
They were coming back to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is down on the coast, from Canada. They'd taken sort of a delayed, sort of like a vacation, sort of a delayed honeymoon kind of thing. And they were going to stay overnight up in northern New Hampshire, except that they heard on the radio that a hurricane was heading toward New Hampshire, and they didn't want to be out on the road with a hurricane.
And incidentally, and I think this has something to do with the story for me, but a biracial couple for back then, extraordinary circumstances.
Yes, and Betty was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. And Barney worked for the post office when he was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission.
Exactly.
These are very respectable people. And they're coming home. It's late at night. Nobody around. Betty spots a light in the sky. Tells Barney she's watching a UFO. And he says, "Oh, Betty, it's not a UFO. It's probably a Piper Cub." Looking over there, over the mountains, and not many people around in New Hampshire on those roads. And they see it go in front of the moon. I get a kick out of somebody saying, "Oh, it's just Jupiter." Yeah, Jupiter always goes in front of the moon, They see it go near the Old Man of the Mountain, which dropped into the lake later, but it was a geological formation that looked like a man. That's about 48 feet high, and they said it was 1.5 times that height. That doesn't sound like Jupiter either, obviously.
Right.
It comes closer. Now they're beginning to get a little concerned. Barney stops the car in the middle of the road, nobody around, and gets out his binoculars and sees this round, sort of pancake-shaped object, if you will, with a row of windows around the middle. And with the binoculars, he can see inside the windows, and there's a bunch of beings there.
Which they didn't,
and stuff like that. What?
And so, but at the time, that's what happened. But they didn't. All of this was recalled later, right? So they're driving down the road.
The part about they remembered seeing the bodies, the beings inside behind the windows, but then there were strange noises on the car, and they was strange. They drove away. They did two things that Barney would never have done, gone from a primary road to a secondary road, then to a tertiary road. And then there's a fade out, noises again in the car. And they got home 2 hours later than they should have gotten home, which was quite a mystery. And Barney's shoes were scuffed, and he was a meticulous dresser. That was crazy. And Betty's dress was torn, a new dress. Strange. Anyway, Betty called her sister, who's the mother of the co-author of the book, Kathleen Marden's mother. And Kathleen was in the room when this call came through and telling her about seeing the UFO, nothing about being abducted, because she didn't know about it.
Mm-hmm.
They had some health problems. Barney developed ulcers, and the doctor, after a while, says, Barney, there's nothing more I can do for you. I think you really ought to see this psychiatrist. People thought it was all stress with ulcers, which we now know isn't completely true at all. But anyway, the most fortunate thing about the story is the doctor that they were recommended to was Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist from Harvard background, and a world expert on what was then called shell shock war veterans. Now we'd say PTSD. When I say world-class expert, he ran a hospital that had 3,000 beds for such guys coming out of World War II. The Army made a movie, Let There Be Light, starring Dr. Simon, explaining how he brought people back to be among the living, so to speak. Your buddy's head gets blown off next to you. How do you handle that? It's not easy. So Dr. Simon didn't know a darn thing about flying saucers, but he knew a great deal about helping people get over missing time, traumatic experiences, whatever you want to call it. And he said the emotional intensity, he did 10 sessions each, Betty and Barney, separately now, so that they couldn't tell, and induced amnesia at the end of each session, so they couldn't tell the other one what went on.
Right.
And he had to stop one session each because he didn't think they could handle it. The terror. And Kathleen has made available tapes, copies of those tapes. And Dr. Simon, in writing, said that the emotional intensity was every bit as great as it was for those shell-shock war veterans that he worked with. Now, coming from him,
exactly,
that means a great deal. It's not a parlor hypnotist kind of thing. And so a recognized world-class expert. And under hypnosis comes the story that they were abducted on board, treated as specimens in separate rooms, stick a needle here, scrape some skin there, cut a lock of skin here. And all the details are in the book. One of the strangest things was that Betty, under hypnosis, she's trying to get the leader, has a great line. I know you're not from around here. Where are you from? Understatement of the year.
Right.
And he shows her what I can only describe as a three-dimensional model, maybe a hologram, 3 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet, a bunch of stars, supposedly base stars and trade routes and occasional expeditions. And Betty's looking at this thing, and I can imagine what was going in Dr. Simon's head. What is this all?
Well, because at that time, nobody had heard of an abduction, so this
That's
doctor
right.
has
There was
never.
no model for that.
There was no model for any of this, so he probably doesn't know how to deal with it. But he's hearing this for the first time. Should be writing it down for his book that he. But anyway,
well, he taped all the sessions, and to his credit, after Betty describes this star map she sees, and when she asks him, "Where are you on the map?" the wise guy says, "You know where you are?" "No, I don't know anything about astronomy. How can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at?" End of discussion. Well, Dr. Simon asks Betty if she can remember what this map looked like. She said yes. She's had good 3D memory. And he gave her a post-hypnotic suggestion. If and only if you can remember it accurately, please draw it later on. She went home, she drew it, brought it in next time. It's in the book.
Okay, stop right there. I need everybody to understand exactly. Well, what year did she draw the star map? What year?
Would have been early 64.
Early 64. And you know where I'm going with this with 1969. So we'll visit that in a second. But she draws this star map from a 3D visual that she got from her, her captive, her whatever abductor. She draws this star map and she remembers it. She draws it. Now, this to me, this star map, and we're going to spend some time on this, but this was a real game changer. And not only for me, when I found out
not when the book came out.
No, exactly. But because the book came out in 66. So she draws this star map, and then you want to jump ahead and talk about Marjorie Fish now?
Well, yeah. A woman, a school teacher in Ohio, read the book, had studied, she's a member of Menzel, a very bright gal named Marjorie Fish. She'd studied astronomy and biology and so forth. And she wondered if there was anything she could do, and she actually visited Betty in New Hampshire from Ohio to get more information about it. And then she did something nobody else had ever done. She wound up building more than 20 three-dimensional models of our local neighborhood. Little beads on fish line, actually, on a frame. And the hard part is to get them in the right three-dimensional location.
I've seen photographs of her model. It's insane.
Well, she thought she hopefully could find a three-dimensional pattern that matched the two-dimensional drawings.
Exactly.
You needed to have the distances right. And we had lousy values for the distance. The astronomers weren't going anywhere. You needed two angles to see a particular star. It didn't matter whether it was 20 light years or 40 light years, but it does if you're trying to figure out on a 3D basis, you see. And Marjorie, I got a call from APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, because Marjorie had asked them if they knew anybody, a scientist, who could help her. And they thought of me. And because I was traveling a lot, I went to visit Marjorie. I had conversations with her. I was with her in Chicago when she showed one of the models to Dr. Hynek. I was at a MUFON conference where she gave a paper, and I published the first article about her work. And what's remarkable, she's one of the most objective people I ever met. She just died last April, incidentally. And in my movie UFOs Are Real, there's a statement from the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University saying how accurate her work was as students looked at used her models as teaching tools. And the bottom line is she was able to identify the base stars, all the stars in the model. But the important thing is, these big stars that look as big as a nickel, Betty said, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli. That's the constellation of Reticulum, and normally people say, well, who cares? What's special about them? Well, as it turns out, we didn't know it beforehand. They're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood.
Period.
They're only 39, now we know they're 39.3 light years away. Now we have much better data because we used the Hipparcos satellite to measure millions of positions, but that data wasn't available until many years later.
Well, and it certainly wasn't available to Betty when she drew the original star map. And exactly, and that for everybody, you need to really wrap your head around that for a second. She drew the star map in 1964-65, correct?
64. Yeah.
In 64. This information wasn't firmly confirmed for anybody until 1969. Marjorie Fish started putting her star map together in 1968. And for all of this to have happened, it just, I can't, like I said, I just can't wrap my head around it. It's just like, you've got to be kidding me. It's the one thing about the Betty and Barney Hill story that I think just adds to the credibility of everything.
Well, let me finish the specialness about these two stars.
You go, Stan. You go, Stan.
They're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. The sun from the next star is 4.3 light years. These two stars from each other, they're only 39.3 light years from here, which is just down the street. The galaxy's 100,000 light years across, so, this is right down the street. These two stars are only an eighth of a light year apart. They're 30 times closer to each other than the sun is to the next star over. We're out in the boonies. These guys got next-door neighbors, and they're a cool billion years older than the sun. And from a planet around one, looking at the other stars visible all day long, mind you.
Right.
And you could easily determine if they put their Kepler up, a million years ago, they know what else is around. That's one of the strange things. The debunkers don't think that anybody out there is ahead of us somehow.
and what are the, seriously, I don't think anybody's ever done this, but what are the mathematical odds of Marjorie figuring this out from the original star map to have it line up she used our sun, right? Yeah, exactly. So for it to line, what are the odds?
Very, very small is the best I can say. As I say, in my movie, you can hear the comments from the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University. Believe it or not, she couldn't take out the star catalogs. She had to get his permission to copy numbers out of them. Crazy. And so I was very pleased. I published the first article in Saga magazine, everybody's favorite old line.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
But what's interesting is that in Kathleen Marden, her niece, and my book captured, and Kathy did 85% of the work. They have a whole chapter on it and the objections to the model and all that sort of stuff. None of that, of course, was in the interrupted journey. There was a map, and what do you make of this? We don't know. Well, I was able to include all the stuff that's been done, and I got Astronomy Magazine because of my Saga Magazine article. I got the editor of Astronomy Magazine to publish an article in there. Got more response than anything they'd ever published. They published letters for like 11 straight issues, and they put out a 32-page full-color booklet, the Zeta Reticuli incident. They sold 10,000 copies in no time flat. That's unheard of for this kind of thing.
Exactly.
And then Carl Sagan's lawyer threatened to sue them because his name was on the front because he's one of the people who responded. And it turns out the publisher had a brain tumor, died less than 6 months later. But he caved into them, and they made me an offer I couldn't refuse because I was instigated the article. And I wound up with 18,000 copies of this 32-page full-color booklet in my garage in California. But I got rid of them all. I moved many of them here to Fredericton, New Brunswick. And if I had another 15,000 or 18,000, I could sell them too, I think.
Yeah,
but
I would buy one.
It proves the interest, that's the point. And very exciting work. And because of Kepler now, suddenly our old position of we're at the top of the heap because we got the only planets in the universe, right? No, wrong entirely. Right now, the best estimates based on the Kepler data are that there's about a planet per star. Some have 5 planets, and some have none, but overall. So in our galaxy with a couple 100 billion stars, we got a few billion, at least, planets instead of hours. The SETI people used to say that there might be as many as 8,000 places that could send us signals. A better number today would be 8 billion. And I have trouble with SETI, as you know. I say it stands for silly effort to investigate rather than search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but for good reason. The astronomers who attack UFOs don't do their homework. They don't read the 5 large-scale scientific studies that I talk about. They don't know anything about national security. Dr. Tyson of the Hayden Planetarium has stated publicly, the proof that the government can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia. Well, there's a funny remark, which has nothing to do with the NSA, NSC, DIA, CIA, et cetera, et cetera. They also know nothing about technology, interstellar travel. Dr. Tyson himself once stated, a program that I was on too, we weren't there at the same time, Peter Jennings' special in 2005, that our fastest craft would get to the nearest star if it was heading in the right direction in 70,000 years, and that's not fast enough for scientists. Of course, he didn't bother to mention it doesn't have a propulsion system on it.
Right.
Throw a bottle in the ocean.
Right.
Is that going to tell you how long it takes to cross the ocean? I don't think so.
No, exactly. Well, we're up against we're at the top of the hour, and I don't want to cut you off, but I will say this: will you come back on the show when we have some more time?
Yes, and don't forget my my website.
Oh no, we're gonna
www.stantonfriedman.com.
All of that will be up on our website. Everybody you can go over and check that out. But I wanted to jump in and just say really quick. Coming up next, we're going to have Norio Hayakawa in. And I don't want to say anything at all. That's another conversation for Norio and I to have it in a few minutes. But you did a lot of investigating into Bob Lazar.
Yes, I did.
And with everything, we don't have enough time to go into all of it. And again, I would love to have you back on to talk about it. But when all the cards were dealt, how did you feel about Bob in the end?
A very bright guy who's not telling the truth about himself or about his experiences. He claims he has degrees from MIT and Caltech, and neither one ever heard of him.
Well, he did go to Pierce down the street from my house. It's a perfectly fine school.
I've spoken there, believe it or not. And it's close to Caltech. But
yes,
not
it is.
Intellectually.
No. But, he does tell a good story, And
yes, he does tell a good story, and there's an article on my website, I guess, and I've done something about fraud and ufology and stuff. Like I say, he's a very bright guy, but he is not a scientist. We were supposed to meet a couple of times, and somehow he backed out when I was in Las Vegas through George Knapp, outstanding journalists about UFOs, among others.
Absolutely, one of the best.
And so, it's not that I wasn't trying, and I got asked what it would take to convince me, and by a buddy of his, and I said, a resume, a list of his papers, copies of his diplomas, maybe, stuff like that. And I sent him a whole batch of stuff. I never got anything back. So I'm sorry. I tried. I've done more, I think, than anybody else.
Well, I would love to have you back on again. I enjoyed it, and thank you, Mr. Friedman. Seriously.
My pleasure.
And we'll get you on again. I'll have all of the links up for everybody on the website, going over to Stan, your books, and they can check out the Bob Lazar fraud.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. We'll talk to you soon.
Night. Bye.
All right. This is Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. We are on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Coming up next, Norio Hayakawa. We're going to take a quick break. KJCR, JimmyChurchRadio.com. We'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Take us away, Doug Aldrich.